Oh, yeah, he has no trouble. There we go. Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Iowa Panfishing. Thanks for joining me. Picked up this book in a used bookstore in Galena, Illinois. America's favorite fishing, a complete guide to angling for panfish. My wife and I were up there for a couple of days, and we love going through used bookstores, looking for old books, literary treasures. And I stumbled across this, and so I picked it up. So this episode of Iowa Panfishing is a little different in that there's going to be very little video of fishing, and I'll explain why. But I do have a fish story to share with you. So it was just yesterday, and I was out once again at my friend Nate and Sue's pond in Cedar County, Iowa. For the last month, I have been working pretty diligently to reduce the surplus population of tiny bluegill out of their main pond. As I've mentioned in other videos, they had a pond management company come out to their property and did a shock test of the main pond and another much smaller pond called the island pond to see what the fish population was like in those ponds and the health of the fish and size, what have you. And what they determined about the main pond is that the bass are about 125% of the size they should be for their age, but there's not enough of them. On the other hand, the bluegill are all very small, or most of them are very small, and there are far too many of them. So to bring balance to that ecosystem in that pond, the pond management company suggested removing as many of the bluegill as they could. So Nate and Sue have asked me, and they didn't have to ask twice. They've asked me to fish their pond, and since they know I love to catch panfish, I love to catch bluegill, if they asked me if I wouldn't mind taking some of the bluegill out of the pond, catching as many as I could. So it's been a little less than a month, only a day or two less than a month. And thus far on the main pond, I've removed about 430 bluegill, not with a net, one by one, hook and worm. And out of the island pond, I removed, I think, about 110. And then we paused removing the bass on that smaller pond, the island pond. The bass growth was stunted at about 12 to 15 inches, and there were too many of them to count. And so I was pulling bass out, I was pulling bluegill out, and Nate and Sue are still awaiting the final report from the pond management company. So because that pond is so much smaller, they asked that I stop harvesting from that smaller pond, continue to fish it if I want to for just the enjoyment of it, but to stop harvesting from that smaller pond. The main pond, again, take as many bluegill as I could out. catch and release on the bass. The pond management company, for whatever reason, didn't find any crappie in the main pond. But yet, this summer, I've caught what the Iowa DNR considers trophy size crappie for our state. I've caught 4 at over 14 inches there and dozens of tiny ones. So I don't know if the fish were just too deep when they did that particular shock test of the main pond. But there are definitely crappie in there, but I'm catching and releasing all the crappie too. All right. So yesterday I'm out at the main pond, and I was actually, I didn't take a camera out, didn't take my video camera out. I was out there, yes, to catch some bluegill, pulled another 22 out in the short time I was there fishing for bluegill. But I was really out there to pray and to listen to a couple of sermons in a theological discussion with my pastors and a couple brothers in my church, a really good one. And so I've been studying and praying about a particular theological issue, and it's been really good. And I know out at Nate and Sue's pond that it would be quiet out there. I'd have the pond to myself. And so I turned the car stereo up and casted my bobber out and was catching a bunch of little bluegill. So let me turn that off. So after a while, the bite started to slow down. It's getting a little close to the dinner hour. I've got about a 40-minute drive home from Nate and Sue's place. So I had just a short time, so I thought, all right, I'm going to move over to another part of the pond. And I've tried to do that. I've tried to catch bluegill in every part of the pond because they do travel and they gather in clusters. And it's a 5-acre pond, a good-sized pond, and so I know they were just going to be in one spot. So there's an area of the pond known as the boat launch. It's a hardened gravel launch for boat and kayak, and I knew there were plenty of bluegill over in that area. There's small coves on either side, the east and west side of this little jetty that makes up the boat launch. So I went over there, kept the car running, knew I didn't have much time, so I didn't pull out all of my gear, left my net, my tackle box, 3 of my poles in the car, and just pulled out my tiny little Zebco $35 ultralight Zebco 33 spinning reel combo, and the bucket that I had the bluegill in, and a little tiny igloo cooler that I had my worms in. I figured that's all I'm going to need. I'm going to catch a few bluegill, and then I'm going to head home. Well, I got a couple of bites, but it wasn't producing anything. It was unusually slow there. And then I casted toward a point across the small cove on the west side of the boat launch jetty, and got a hit, and it was a particular kind of hit. Now, if you're fishing with a bobber, certainly bluegill can hit it on the run, just take the bobber right under, and off it goes. But many times, especially with the tinier bluegill, the bluegill just peck. They just kind of peck at it until they commit. And so you'll see the bobber just kind of bounce around a little, maybe go halfway under, maybe go left or right a little, and you're just waiting for the fish to commit. But this particular bite wasn't the quick shot under the water for the bobber like a bluegill hitting it on the run. This was a slow, steady descent under the water. And I thought, oh, okay, that is probably a bass. That's probably going to be a bass. So again, I'm fishing with a 5.5 foot Zebco 33 ultralight spinning combo. I've got 4-pound high-vis line on there. I've got a small 1 to 1.25 inch plastic bobber on there, plastic bobber on there, a couple of feet of leader, and 1/64 ounce jig head as my terminal tackle, and a minuscule piece of night crawler. I was getting a dozen baits out of one night crawler. That's how small the pieces were, because again, the fish I was fishing for were tiny bluegill. So this was a bite that told me right away, and certainly over the last month, watching a bobber bounce around hundreds and hundreds of times, there was something about the way this bobber descended under the water that said, that is not a bluegill. But again, I'm thinking bass. Well, I set the hook, and I knew as soon as I set the hook, I'm not going to have a 2 or 3 inch bluegill hydroplaning on top of the water as I'm reeling it in. No, my rod tip went over, and I quickly adjusted the drag because I had my drag tight. Because 4-pound test, the biggest bluegill I've caught on their pond was just the other day, 9 1/4 inch, and a very good sized bluegill. But typically that's not going to bust a 4-pound line. But I knew this was something else, and so I quickly loosened the drag, and as soon as I loosened up the drag, zzz, starts to run. Bass, at least in this pond, bass don't typically go on long runs. They might dive a little, it might be a short run, but it's not a prolonged run. And I thought, oh no, I've done it again. I've hooked into a carp. There are a bunch of carp in this pond. They've removed a bunch of carp on this pond, some sizable carp, 20, 30 plus pound carp out of this 5-acre pond. And having just experienced catching the biggest fish of my life the week before, what was it, 15.4 pound, 35 inch grass carp, I knew that feeling. I'll never forget that feeling as long as I live. And I was on a carp again. So I by instinct, I immediately look for my net to position my net close to me so that when I get this thing in close, because I'm fishing alone, when I get this thing close, I'm going to try to net this fish. And as I do that, I immediately realized that I had left my net in the car. My car was a good 20 to 25 feet or more behind me. The rear hatch of the car was open so that I could hear the stereo from inside my car. I'm listening to a sermon, and I thought, oh no, I'm gonna lose this fish because I don't have my net. I've got to get my net. And so I come up with the idea of lifting my rod as high as I could over my head, and then to keep the line up, to keep tension on the line, and just slowly starting walking backwards toward my car. And so that's what I did, one slow step at a time, fighting the fish with one hand, not reeling, keeping the tension on the line with just by walking backwards and having the rod tip up. I was able to make my way all the way back to my car and reach into the back of the car and grab my net. So that part of the problem is now solved. Now there's a new problem. Now I've got my net in my hand, in my left hand. I've got my pole in my right hand. I've got to walk back the 25 feet or so to the bank. But now as I walk forward, if I don't reel, that line's going to go slack. So I'm sharing the story with my wife, Maria, and my daughter, Amanda, yesterday at the dinner table. And of course, Maria, smarter than me, says, well, couldn't you have just thrown your net toward the bank? And then that would free your hand, and then you could just reel in. Duh. Yeah, sure. Could have done that. Yes, but I didn't. So I'm holding this net, this long aluminum net, with my left hand. I free a couple of fingers just so I could start reeling, and I'm trying to work my way toward the bank, and I noticed the line has gone slack. And I thought, oh no, I lost it. So I kept reeling. I get to the bank, and I see my bobber just sitting a couple of feet off the bank, and it's not moving, and the line is slack. And I said, yeah, it spit the hook. I lost it. So I put the net down and just nonchalantly start reeling in, just disappointed that I didn't get this fish. I get all the slack up, and as soon as the line tightened, zzz, that fish was still on, took off, and now the fight is on again. Right about that time, Nate and Sue, who had been out of state for a little R&R for a couple of weeks, they had gotten back just before I had gotten to the pond yesterday, and they thought Nate thought he had seen me or heard me drive by the house down toward the pond, and he came out looking for me, but didn't realize I had driven around to the far northeast end of the pond, so had missed me, and so he was coming back, and then he sees me there by the boat ramp, and so the boat launch, and so he comes down and smiling and happy to see me, and as he pulls up, I said, "Nate, I could use your help. I've got another carp on here," and he looks at me and says, "You did it again?" I said, "Yep, fishing the same way, same gear. I don't know why these carp are hitting worms, but this carp." So Nate manned the net, and I focused on working this fish in, and we finally got it up close to the bank, and it turned sideways so that it was parallel with the bank, and it was obvious as soon as I saw that fish that it was bigger. It was bigger than the 15-pounder that I had caught just the other day there on the pond. Nate saw it and said, "Oh yeah, that's a big one." So we work it, and it seemed like forever. I was in law enforcement for 20 years, and it's true that whenever you get into any kind of critical incident, a fight or a shooting, something that takes only seconds to transpire seems like it's going on for minutes or even hours. Everything just kind of slows down in the midst of that. Well, it felt like I was fighting this fish forever. I think a realistic estimate is that Nate and I worked on that fish for a good 10 minutes or more, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. So the bank where I was fishing, it kind of just drops off. It's not very high from the water line. It's probably only 6 inches or a foot above the water line, but it just drops straight off, and it made it difficult for Nate to get that net in a right position to net this fish. So Nate has the idea, "Hey, do you think we can work it around the boat launch here to the actual boat launch where the gravel ramp goes down into the water, where we can walk right up to the water line?" And yeah, that's a great idea. So we slowly worked the fish. We walked that way, maneuvered the fish, got the fish in front of the boat launch, and as soon as the fish saw us again, heads out to the center of the pond. All right, so we keep working it. Nate makes several swipes at this fish when it was close enough, and as soon as that net hit the water, the fish took off. Carp are very skittish kind of fish. They see you, they're gone. And so we tried. Eventually, long story short, eventually that fish tires out. We're able to get it right up to the edge of the water and the boat ramp. Nate is able to get that net behind it and underneath it, and basically drags it off the water. And just as Nate gets that fish out of the water, the line snaps. All right, so now it's time to weigh and measure this fish. Nate started filming on his phone, and so we were able to get that footage of measuring it and weighing it. And one of the things the pond management company recommended is taking some of the carp from the main pond and putting them in the at least 2 other ponds that they know of their 5 or 6 ponds that have fish. The island pond being one of them. And so that day when they did the shock test, they were able to capture a carp. And so they moved that carp from the main pond to the island pond. They've been wanting to put a carp in what's called the back pond, which is completely covered in moss and muck and lots of grass, lots of undergrowth, no carp in that particular pond. So in God's providence, I'm able to bring this fish in. Nate's there. Had Nate not been there and not told me that they wanted to move one to the back pond, I just would have released that fish back into the main pond if I was able to land that fish by myself. I'm not sure I could have done that without Nate's help. So Nate runs back up to the house, gets a really large bucket, and I keep water on the fish. I'm making bucket runs from the water to where we have the fish, and keeping it wet, keeping its gills moving, forcing water in its mouth, keeping it alive. And then we transported it to the back pond. So what you're going to see now, that's about a 15-minute story. What you're going to see now is footage from measuring and weighing this carp. And I'll let that part of the video tell you its size. And then you're going to see Nate and I together release this pond, release this carp, this grass carp, into what is called the back pond. So I hope you enjoy this.
That is so much bigger. That is so much bigger.
I got you on video. We'll pull any still out of here we need to.
Tape.
Fun.
You know, I came out here today to pray. I didn't pray for this.
No, but look at how fat that thing is. $37?
37 and a half.
37 and a half.
37 and a half.
Got a weight coming in.
All right, so what I'm gonna have to do to...
What I'm gonna do is get a big like moving bin. We'll put him in there, run him out to the back pond. All right, give me a smile. Oh, wow, so great.
18, 19. It keeps 19.35.
19.35. All right.
4 pounds. 4 pounds heavier than the last one.
Look at that
All right,
big fella.
What do you want to do, bro?
Folks, putting a carp in the pond.
Does this pond have a name?
We just call this the back pond.
The back pond, okay.
So, what a beauty.
That is a beautiful grass carp.
They're pretty hardy, I think. Look at that guy.
Oh my goodness. All right, let's see, what's the best way to get
Probably right in here. You want my boots or you want me to? Can help however. Right on this edge over here. Yep.
over here?
Here, I can get out of ways.
There you go.
Just
Then
pull that.
you just pull the, you want that? Yep. You just pull the bottom end apart like you would a pair of pliers. Rock him back and forth, get his gills in the water. Oh, he has no trouble. There we go.
Sweet.
Woo!
Oh, hang on.
Oh, yeah, a little deep, huh?
Just muck.
37 and a half inches, 19.35 pounds. 2.5 inches bigger than what I thought would be the biggest fish I would ever catch that I caught on the same pond just a week before. 2.5 inches longer than last week's carp, almost 4 pounds heavier. So now this is the biggest fish I've ever caught in my life. And I'll never forget catching that fish. I'll never forget catching the fish before it. And there are other catches that I'll never forget. But the main reason I'm never going to forget this catch is because I got to do it with my friend Nate. I got to share that moment with someone in real time. We got to work that fish together, encourage each other. We landed that fish together. And then we kept it alive together. We transported it together. We released it together. We did it all together. And so the best part of this wonderful memory is being able to share it with my friend Nate. All right. Thanks everyone for watching this edition of Iowa Pan Fishing. I hope you didn't mind the storytelling. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, God bless.